This is David Roberts here, youth pastor. I am going to be joined shortly by our own Blair Gore, our children's pastor, if you've not had a chance to meet her yet, as well as our guest this morning, Mike McHargue, who many of you might be more familiar with under the name Science Mike. We are really, really excited that Mike's going to be joining us this morning. He is been a really influential thinker and writer and speaker in my own life and journey. I've had the privilege of talking with him a number of times, and every single time I'm just blown away, even digitally, hopefully you'll be able to experience this as well, because even digitally, Mike is able to just convey this soothing, calming, affirming energy, maybe better than anyone I've ever talked to in my life. So really, really excited for all of you to get to experience that with us this morning. Before we dive into that, just want to remind everyone that we are just constantly evolving the ways that we are staying connected here digitally with our watershed community. Many of you got to participate in our follow-up Zoom session with Tommy Allgood and with Matt earlier this week, where we sort of got to recap and really even dive deeper into the conversation that we had last Sunday with Austin Channing Brown. And that was just an incredible experience. And so I encourage you to participate in things like that as the opportunities arise. This is a great time to jump into a block if you don't have one right now. Many of our blocks are using technology like Zoom and Google Hangout to keep community going during this time of physical distancing. And so if you want more information about that, then just to remind you, the email address to kind of send your interest to is Matt O'Neil, O-N-E-I-L, M-A-T-T-O-N-E-I-L, Matt O'Neil at watershedcharlotte.com. And then, of course, as a reminder, if you want information about what's going on with our children or students, you can email Blair at watershedcharlotte.com or myself with the student info at David at watershedcharlotte.com. But now I want to welcome Blair here with us. Hi, Blair.
Hey, good morning, David. How are you?
I am doing well.
Awesome. I'm excited for today. So for those who don't know me, guys, my name is Blair, and I work with our kids here at Watershed Charlotte, and I am pretty new. I'm only, I think, 5 weeks in is what we decided, maybe 6 now. But just really excited to be with David today to talk to Science Mike, as we call him. He is one of those people that I really appreciate his approach to thinking, and the way he speaks with honesty and humility and this vulnerability that's there. It just is really meaningful. So I'm really looking forward to diving a little deeper with him today.
Yeah, I don't want to oversell it, but I don't think I can oversell it. I mentioned this a moment ago. I've had the privilege of interacting with Mike a couple times. I planned a conference a number of years ago where he was one of the keynote speakers. I co-host a podcast with Thomas, who you all met last week, as well as Becca Epley, one of our fellow watershedders, and we had the privilege of interviewing Mike on that. And in both of those instances, just because I've read his book and I've listened to him a bunch of times, there was almost a part of me that wasn't excited, because I'm like, I know Mike, I'm familiar. There's nothing really new that he can tell me. I'm glad, this can be cool for other people, but it's kind of whatever. And both times, I was just blown away. I'm not sure if I've ever met someone who has more of just a pastoral shepherding energy about them. And I think just amidst what we're experiencing right now as a community, as a people, here on this planet, that energy that he brings and that warmth and that authenticity, I think, is needed now more than ever. I mean, in fact, I got to talk to him earlier this week. We were just really briefly over the phone, kind of touching base about this conversation we're going to have here this morning. And he ended the conversation just thanking our community for the steps that we're taking and encouraging us and exhorting us that, yes, as hard as this is, like, this really might be saving lives. And I hadn't thought about it in that way. And so even just in that little kind of gesture from him was just so affirming. So I'm really, really excited about our conversation this morning.
Yeah.
All right, Watershed, we are so excited. We have Mike McHargue. Many of you might know him better as Science Mike. If you are not familiar with Mike, he is the host of the Ask Science Mike podcast, one of the founding members of the Liturgist podcast, although he stepped away from that, the author of Finding God in the Waves, and then the brand new book that I'll let him tell us about in a little bit, that's going to be coming out, I think, end of this month, April 28th or so. And so we'll talk about his new book here in a moment. But Mike, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm so glad to be with you today.
So we're going to get kind of into your new book, into your story in a little bit here. But one thing, Mike, that I've really appreciated in the last couple of weeks is that you have been hopping on social media and recording these videos about the present crisis, the COVID-19 crisis. And one thing I've appreciated about you in the time that I've known of you and known of your work and whatnot has been just this kind of calming, authentic energy that you bring, not just to complex situations and complex information, but to potentially anxiety-ridden situations and information. And so, I've been encouraging people over the last couple of weeks to follow you on social media, check out your videos. You have become my go-to source for COVID-19 information. And I just really, really appreciate the way that you make what can be some really stressful and confusing data points, both accessible, but also, conveyed in a way that doesn't lead to despair, that leaves room for hope. And so just to kind of kick things off and maybe almost give people a taste of that energy that you bring, what would you say, today is maybe your biggest or top two kind of takeaways that you would want, that you would hope people are gleaning or taking away from kind of this crisis that we're all kind of collectively navigating right now?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'd want to say is if we're going to talk about a pandemic, and we're going to talk about that in a time when we are kind of gathered together to find a relief from life a little bit. I mean, part of what I really enjoy about faith gatherings is their capacity for us to feel a sense of community, a sense to kind of recharge and feel refreshed. And I would like to begin by saying, if we're going to talk about a pandemic, we just have to acknowledge this stuff is really frightening and stressful and anxiety inducing. And so if we talk anything specific about what we're seeing in science or in the data, it can be really overwhelming. And so I want to let you know that if you're seeing my face right now and you're hearing my voice right now, that I'm not trying to provoke some kind of sense of panic. Quite the opposite. The first takeaway I would want people to know is that COVID-19 is manageable and beatable. We actually can take meaningful actions that reduce the rate of infection and therefore reduce the number of people who will lose their lives from this pandemic. But the second point is less encouraging. We aren't doing a great job of doing that in the United States. States have moved too slowly to do shelter-in-place orders, and the states that have done shelter-in-place orders, some people are not really following them. Even here out in California, we're seeing people cram into farmers markets because that was something that was left as essential. And I want to be very clear, the current data on COVID-19 tells us that it is both far more infectious and far more deadly than we believed it was previously. And right now, we're tracking for 100,000 to 240,000 deaths on the low side in the United States alone. So point one is social distancing and case isolation really does work. And point two is right now, we're doing a poor job of it, and people need to get on board, or else we are going to see a catastrophic loss of life in this country.
Yeah. Sobering stuff. And yet, there's a silver lining there in your first point, in that despite the fact that we're not doing well right now, this isn't something that is just passively happening to us.
Mm-hmm.
One of my biggest takeaways from listening to you over the last couple of weeks is that there really are tangible steps that we can be taking communally, individually, collectively. And listening to you and others who I think have been speaking wisdom into this season, it's changed the way that myself and my family have been responding to things. And so, just kicking off, I want to say thank you for the work that you're doing there. I appreciate it. Keep it up. It is making a difference. And hopefully those listening out here, if you're not familiar with Mike, if you haven't been following him, he is, like I said, my go-to resource right now when it comes to this pandemic. And so I would encourage you, at the end of this, when we're wrapping up, we will let Mike kind of direct you to the ways that you can kind of follow him and stay connected with him going forward.
And I'd like to say to everyone watching right now, go ahead and pat yourself on the back because by doing this virtual worship gathering and getting out of your comfort zone, you're saving lives right now, today. This very experience is saving lives. And the more we do things like this, the more lives that we can save.
That's really, that's encouraging to hear, Mike. I work with our kids at Watershed, and so one of the big things that I'm always thinking about is, how does this affect our kids and our parents? And so you have 2 kids, correct?
2 teens.
Oh, that's fun.
Yes.
And so this is kind of an interesting experience for all of our parents. I've seen a range of emotions and just different emotions, different days from parents as well and from kids. So what would you say, you talk about big and scary things like bring about big and scary emotions sometimes, or serious things bring about serious emotions. And so what is something that you would say to our parents as they're trying to navigate this with kids? What would you offer there for hope?
Yeah, I think first of all, we grown-ups have a tendency to get so focused on trying to meet and attend to our children's emotional needs that we ignore our own emotional needs. And our children are wildly brilliant and sensitive people. And so when our children watch us suppress and mask our emotions in the desire to protect them, that actually sends to our children a message that their feelings aren't okay. So I'm not saying run around in a panic. I'm not saying tell your kids that things are hopeless. But I'm saying that if you feel sad, it's okay to cry even in front of your children. That if you feel afraid, it's okay to say that you feel afraid right now. Your child may actually feel a sense of solidarity and inclusion when you share your feelings and your children see you express your feelings comfortably and then move to a point of emotional resolution. So one of the things you can be doing for your kids right now is working on your own emotional fluency and your own emotional intelligence. And we're all stuck at home together. This is really stressful. I think a lot of people are figuring out, especially with young children, how wonderful it is to go into an office for a few hours. And let's be real, toddlers and young children, they don't do boundaries really well. They don't respect your needs for space. And so like leaning into these times while everybody's stuck at home, any kind of structured time, if you need to pop on Netflix for an hour, pop on Netflix for an hour and get your rest on to build the resiliency you need to respond to your children meaningfully. So I'd say first kind of watch out for your emotional needs and set up a routine where you have time to rest and recharge even with your children at home. And then from there, be open to having conversations where you let them know any of their questions are okay and any of their feelings are okay. We have a tendency to want to rush in and fix and resolve everything that our children face, and that doesn't equip them for the world that they live in. So it's good and it's helpful, and research shows it's helpful for us to not be able to answer every question. What children need to know is that they are loved, supported, and accepted, not that their parents have all the answers. So we model that we accept their feelings, we allow their feelings, and we show people, especially our children, how to process their feelings to some point of resolution. And then we just start building routine and ritual. We're all building new routine and new ritual right now. So in my house, we're setting up movie nights. We're setting up game nights. We're taking walks every day as a family. We're doing anything. We're getting up at a normal time and starting our day with showers and breakfast and everything like we normally would. We've started distance learning out here in California. So, I've set up a rule that, that's less structured right now with this a Google Classroom based model. But my kids, I've said, guess what? You still can't do phone games during school hours. If you get done with all your schoolwork, fantastic. Now go ahead and take some reading time. Take some, if you need enrichment courses, I'll help you find things on Khan Academy. But anything we can do to establish a new normal and a new routine is going to do a lot to help children feel grounded and normal in this very challenging time.
Absolutely. Thanks for that. As you're talking, I'm just kind of thinking through the circus of a household that we have right now, with 3 kids, 6 and under. Definitely not a lot of boundaries going on there. And so I guess kind of piggybacking off of that response, Mike, one of the negative feelings I know that I've wrestled with over the last couple of weeks is related to, those new routines and those new structures, and, kind of maybe wrestling with a sense of anxiety or even shame, when it comes to trying to balance, my work, my wife's work, my kids' school work, and then all of our kind of collective emotional health. And so you have written prolifically and vulnerably in the past about shame and anxiety. Your new book that we made reference to, You're a Miracle and a Pain in the Ass, which this might be a good transition point to start introducing some of your ideas from that book. But can you just speak to maybe shame and anxiety in general? And I know those have been part of your journey, which you talked about in your previous book a little bit. So maybe for those who don't know your story as well, some background there, but not to frame it in a negative way. I have loved and been blessed in the past to hear you talk about shame.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things. Number one, all of our feelings, including shame and anxiety, are things that our brain uses to protect us and help us survive. So I like to start by, when we say something like negative emotion, the negative we're referring to is the sensation we feel. In other words, we might even say it's an unpleasant feeling. It's a feeling we don't enjoy. But I don't think there's any such thing as a bad or a negative emotion. All of our feelings give us information about the world and give us information about how we're responding to the world. What we know about anxiety is a feeling that often our brains use to mask other feelings. And that anxiety typically comes when we are preoccupied with the future and trying to control it. What's really remarkable about being a human being is we have specialized brain tissue kind of right up here behind the orbit of our eyes, called the orbitofrontal cortex. That's part of our prefrontal cortex, which is part of our neocortex. Gosh, did you know you would get neuroanatomy this morning? But basically, that's a patch of tissue. The neocortex is tissue that's kind of wrapped around your brain. It's about as thick as a tortilla, and it's all wrinkled and folded up around the more inner parts of the brain. That's where your rational thinking happens. Language, philosophy, culture, visual processing, all these kind of amazing things the human brain does. But the orbitofrontal cortex, its job is to try to predict the future, to try to build a model of the world that we can act on preemptively. It makes human beings really special. It also lets us feel really anxious. On the other hand, shame and guilt, these are other masking feelings. And these are feelings that are about protecting us from what could happen in the future by having us reflect on what has happened to us in the past. So the messages we receive from society, especially as children, speak into our identity. A really common example would be people who do creative work. When you're a very small child and you draw a picture and your mom says it's great and they hang it on the fridge, wow, that feels really good and really validating. But the first time you draw a picture and you hand it to someone and they're indifferent, or they actually go, well, this isn't very good, that gets integrated into our sense of self and our sense of identity. and it becomes shame. And the message we might receive in that moment is, I'm not an artist, right? And most people would say they're not artists because at some point they had an experience that made them feel shame about creative expression. But shame can be involved in anything, including the expression of emotion. So if a small child cries, and let's say that they're a boy living in the South, and an adult says, boys don't cry, then the child will feel shame about expressing a feeling. And in the future, as an adult, when that child grows up and begins to feel sadness, they learn sadness is not socially appropriate. And as social animals, humans always want to do things that allow them to fit in. And so instead of feeling sad, the brain bypasses that feeling and inhibits that feeling, called an inhibitory affect, using shame. So shame and anxiety are feelings that are used to mask our true feelings, our real feelings. And often, if we're present in the moment, as opposed to living in the past or living in the future, and there's exercises you can do to learn to be more present. But when we become more present and we focus on the feeling that we have now, we often learn more about ourselves and about what we're feeling. So if I just feel anxious right now about a pandemic, it tells me about as much as the check engine light in your car tells you about what's happening with your engine. Not really anything at all other than something's wrong. If your check engine light is on, your car could be about to immediately break down, or you could be just like a couple miles over changing your oil. The only way to learn more specifics is to open the hood and have a look. And the only way to learn more about our feelings is to be present with them, to listen to our body's sensations, and then allow our feelings to come forward. And I don't know about you, but I've often found that when I feel anxious, what's actually happening is I'm afraid to experience a feeling that I learned in the past through shame that I'm not allowed to feel. For me, that might be sadness. That might be anger. That might be actual fear, kind of terror itself. These are challenging times. But whereas anxiety tells us nothing and we just get stuck there, when we learn to connect with and access the emotion behind the anxiety, two things happen. Number one, we learn more specific information about what's wrong. If I'm having anxiety or shame, to shame like you talked about, like, well, I'm not doing the things I should be doing, right? What's often behind shame is fear of not belonging, fear of not connecting. And as soon as I name that I'm afraid people think I'm a bad person if I can't juggle working from home and taking care of my children, naming that fear helps our brain start to move toward a place of resolution. We don't feel afraid forever like we can feel anxious forever. Or for anxiety, or shame forever. For anxiety, the same thing. It might be I'm anxious because I feel really sad, and I feel sad because I don't know who I know is going to be alive and who's going to be dead a year from now. And that's always true. But the pandemic means more people than I'm accustomed to in this period are going to die than I'm used to. But when I name that, and I allow myself, and listen to me, friends, I do this every day right now. I take the time to cry and to grieve about the future. When I do that, our bodies know how to move us to a place of relief that we call core affect, a place of calm and curiosity and openness and clarity. We find that place on the other side of letting our feelings actually be expressed. So I wouldn't call guilt or shame negative feelings. I would call them warning feelings. And the warning they're giving us is that some other feeling that we don't feel equipped to deal with at the moment is down there somewhere. And often when we find the time and the space to sit and be present with that feeling, we find relief and also learn about ourselves in the process.
That's good. I really like that. You mentioned a couple times in that, just past and history and experiences. And so for people who maybe don't know your story very well, I want to invite you and ask you to share some parts of that, because I think that our community is very, I think that there's a lot of pieces of your story that they would also resonate with in their own story. So if you could share some of that and some of your past, I think that would be great.
Sure, I'd love to. Thank you. Probably like a lot of people here right now, I grew up in the evangelical church in the southeastern United States. I was a Southern Baptist. I loved it. I was a really confident Baptist. It was very, very neat to know exactly what was morally right or wrong in any situation, to know that if I read my Bible enough, I knew exactly what God thought about any issue, and that I could therefore do the right thing with utter certainty that I was not only right, but behaving in a way that was going to lead me to go to heaven eternally one day. Oh, it was wonderful. I was also a nerd. I had very few friends. And so I was bullied a lot at school. And so church ended up being a place that was really safe for me, because nobody beat me up at church the way I got beat up at school. And none of the other children at church were actively cruel to me the way that children were at school. So I took away from my young childhood a couple of things. One, that church is a safe place. And two, that God is real, and that God loves me personally. And that if I follow God's plan for my life as outlined in the Bible, I'll have a good life, both today and eventually when I die. It was wonderful. It was wonderful those years. Now, there were some problems. I didn't know how to handle. I had a friend in high school who was gay, and I didn't know how to handle the fact that I really liked him and he's a good friend, and he was going to go to hell. I could never figure out how to reconcile that. But, aside from minor speed bumps like that, life felt pretty good. And I became a deacon and a Sunday school teacher and a very active part of our church in my 20s and young 20s. I got married, 2 kids, I got baptized, just like went into the full white evangelical life plan. I was even like doing Financial Peace University. I mean, the whole thing. And it stopped working because this worldview didn't give me the tool set to deal with the failings of moral leaders in my life. So when people who believed what I said I believed would do things out of step with their faith, I didn't really know how to handle that. And that was really exacerbated in one particular instance with my dad, who was the music minister of our church, had an affair and left my mom after being married for 30 years. But me being a young deacon, I thought, no problem. Dad just needs an accountability partner. That can be me. There's surely no conflict of interest in a son trying to lead his father through an accountability program in Scripture to save his parents' marriage. Gosh, it was a terrible idea. I thought it would work. I literally told my dad we would read the Bible together and kick the devil out of his life. And it did not work. Number one, I could read all the Scripture I wanted, and it didn't really change my dad's life patterns or behaviors. And number two, reading the Bible so much just filled me with confusion. I'd read the Bible many times, but never what I'd call cover to cover. I'd always have some study guide where I followed a guided tour of Scripture. And this time I just sat down in Genesis and read the Revelation. I did that in 3 months. I was so confused at the end, I repeated it. I ended up reading the Bible 4 times that year. And I was just wrecked with questions like, this God that I loved had sent an army into a nation and said, kill all the soldiers who already live there, like destroy the people who live in this land. And by the way, make sure you get the women and the children and the livestock, leave nothing. And when the armies would fail to do that, God would get angry that the people didn't kill enough other people. And I couldn't connect that with Jesus in the New Testament. Didn't make any sense to me. And there were a million things like that. When I got to Paul, I was like, Paul is crazy, right? So I kind of get through the whole Bible. It doesn't make sense. So I asked Google for help like we do in the modern era and tried to look up biblical contradictions. And I did find different apologists online who would kind of take you through why all these things made sense. Very overly elaborate ways of explaining this, by the way. And then I also found something called the Skeptic's Annotated Bible, where atheists explain why the Bible is ridiculous BS, effectively. And they're like, The reason Genesis 1 and 2 don't match science is because it was written by ignorant desert people thousands of years ago who didn't know about science. And I was like, okay, yeah, that actually makes sense. And I find that notion really kind of offensive. So I kind of went through this period of falling away theologically, but I thought God was taking me somewhere, that all this had a reason. I started reading books by atheists. I knew I was heading to some point of absolute faith reconciliation after a dark night of the soul. But no, after I don't know how long, 9 months of this, I realized I didn't believe in God anymore. And I left my faith behind. It was a tough process. I was afraid of social rejection. So at first I pretended to be a Christian. I did that for a couple of years. And then I just started to identify as an atheist. And it's actually really nice. The kind of questions a lot of us struggle with about what is right or wrong, or especially questions of suffering. Why do bad things happen? Because the universe is an indifferent mathematical system. Suffering is just a thing. It's a signal for organisms to know things are bad and to fight to survive. Oh, that's much easier than why God doesn't answer prayer, right? So I was an atheist for a while, and then I had a mystical experience. I write about it in my book, Finding God in the Waves. I've told the story many times, but I felt God's presence directly with me one night in a very powerful way. And it was so beautiful that me, as an atheist, was convinced that I had a brain tumor, and that's why I was hallucinating. So I went and got a CAT scan from a neurologist and an MRI, and the neurologist was like, nope, there's no tumor. And I was like, no, there's no tumor, which is not a normal reaction. But it meant I had to figure out what was going on with this light. And that led me to this period of my life where I started studying cosmology and brain science and all these things, and ended up landing in a place of kind of a science-informed Christian mysticism, where I love and value faith, where I love and value God. And I just admit I can't answer any questions of substance about theology, and I let other people worry about that stuff. And instead, I allow my faith to transform my life in ways that make me feel better and make it easier for me to love others well. And that's kind of the journey I've been on since 2012, is just trying to figure out how to let a God that really confuses me, that I wouldn't even defend to anyone, any kind of theological notion of who or what this God is, but how I can let these moments of contemplation and this great tradition of Christianity inform me on how to live well. How was that?
That was perfect. Thank you for allowing other people to sort of go on this journey with you over that, in that time, and kind of being vulnerable enough to allow people to kind of peer behind the curtain and see not only how you processed that journey, but to process it alongside you. And I feel like, kind of piggybacking off of that, I feel like your new book is now coming to tackle a new question, or at least a question that has kind of maybe been kind of defining for you or big for you over the last number of years as you've gone through the journey that you just described. And that question is, why do we sometimes do the things we don't want to do, or why don't we do the things we do want to do? And so where, without spoiling the whole book, because we want people to buy it, but where do you feel like this journey took you, and kind of in the process of writing about it and turning it into your next book?
Yeah, my book started out as how to be Science Mike, basically. I was doing work that I thought was important and meaningful and significant, and is. And it was going well, and I felt good. I thought everyone should be able to live a life where they feel like they're doing meaningful, purposeful work, and where they get in touch with the pain of their past in a way that makes them feel more free today. So how can I write a guide for other people to do that? And then my life started to just completely come unglued. My daughter, Madison, was diagnosed with anorexia, and I had some heart problems, and I was diagnosed with autism, and I started having panic attacks as past trauma started to surface. And quite the contrary, believing that I was some expert, I realized I was still very early on the journey of learning about myself. And I read the Bible every day, believe it or not. And I was reading through Romans, and I saw this passage where the Apostle Paul says, I don't understand myself. I do what I think is wrong, and I don't do what I think is right. And I thought, like, Paul, do you have a camera in my house? What is going on? So I started reading more Paul to try to figure out Paul's answer to that dilemma. And I just realized all Paul ever did was wrestle with that dilemma. He never answered it. And that was really frustrating. And so I tried to figure out how to get some answers. So I started turning to psychology and sociology and interpersonal neurobiology and behavioral economics. And in a very science-like way, I started looking for solutions to the problem. And started going through trauma therapy. And I started learning all of these things. And I realized that a couple of things happened. Number one, so many of us spend so much time in guilt and shame that comes from our childhoods, and we just feel awful about ourselves. And as I studied myself and studied the human animal, I realized what truly wondrous and amazing creatures we are, and the things that we often don't like about ourselves, the ways we have trouble controlling our impulses, the way that we struggle to deal with our own feelings, how all of these things were amazing tools that our bodies use to keep us alive, and how miraculous that was. And so part of the book is responding to this sense of basic shame and guilt about ourselves, and be like, no, anything you've been told in the past that you're not a genuine miracle is wrong. But the other thing I see is, in response to all of these oppressive narratives around identity, is then people move into this other state where they're like, everything about me is beautiful and wonderful and perfect, and no one can stop me or shame me about anything. And the fact is, the complexity of the human animal and the way we contextualize our past actually leads us to behave in ways that are often bad for ourselves and bad for the society that we live in. That's the pain in the ass part of the title. And so the book is an attempt to look at the two sides of the coin of human existence and help people not get the answers from my book. The point of my book is not you read this book and now you're an expert in life and living. The point of this book is to invite people into their own individual journey of self-acceptance and growth. Self-acceptance meaning learning to love and accept yourself as you are, and growth meaning to understand that you can, will, and should grow and change over time.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned in a podcast recently that, whether you understand it providentially, serendipitously, completely randomly, that the message of this book that you just named there feels almost weirdly, uniquely relevant to this crisis that we are all collectively experiencing right now. Could you speak into that a little bit, the way that kind of in a weird way, this is kind of a book for such a time as this?
Yeah, every time I've done media appearances, people have talked about it. But in this moment, when we try to deal with our feelings about fear and anxiety, about what's happening in the future, and frustration about the ways that other people are responding, or we can't understand why, when we're home and there's this opportunity, we could be working or organizing or doing these things, why we feel no motivation. I accidentally answered all those questions in the book as we understand the division between our conscious experience, where we live moment by moment, and all that's happening in our brain-body systems, and how complicated that becomes when you get more than a person in a room or in a society together. This book is, by total coincidence, absolutely timely as kind of a survival guide to dealing with yourself and people during a pandemic.
As you talk about this book and talk about helping people see both sides, are you a 9 on the Enneagram?
I am a 9. Yeah, guilty as charged.
I knew it. I knew it. So what role does that play in your writing, or has it played in this process of creating this book?
Yeah, that's kind of a gift of mine, is to see different perspectives and to acknowledge and accept them and almost never choose among them. The confusing thing about people like me is you go like, well, how can you accept two people's positions that are contradictory? It's because I accept that people have those positions, and that arriving as one as being the factual interpretation is pretty challenging. By the way, that's why I love science. It lets me ascribe statistical confidence to different ideas and notions. That's very helpful for someone like me. But I'm also learning in the process of writing the book that some of what I mean when I say I'm an Enneagram 9 is that I am wildly codependent, and that because of my childhood and my faith tradition, I've been taught to behave in a way that I try to never, ever, ever, ever upset anyone ever, so that they will accept me. And in fact, I take a lot of ownership over managing other people's feelings and forget to manage my own. And so part of this book and my life since the book has been written and published has been leaning into this system of codependence and understanding how I can do a better job of owning and naming my feelings and my needs, and not feeling responsible for the feelings and needs of other people. And when I say that this book invites you into your own journey, there's different types of codependence, and not everyone is codependent. So if someone who is in a different place in life, you might actually need to take more ownership for how your actions impact others and not less. Whereas I need to learn to do the opposite. The difficulty of life growth and transformation is understanding how many different starting points there are and how many different paths that we can take along the way. So for me, the Enneagram 9 codependent thing means, yeah, I'm learning to name my feelings. I'm learning to let other people deal with theirs. But for someone else, that may not be the next right step.
I kind of want to hear, piggybacking on that Enneagram 9 question, whenever you made that transition to atheism, and I know you've talked about you were a deacon in your church, what did those relationships look like at that point with your church people? And how did you navigate that if you never wanted to kind of upset the apple cart, you know?
It was really unhealthy. For 2 years, I pretended to be a Christian and continued to be a deacon and continued to teach Sunday school. 2 years. I didn't want to upset anybody. And then I had this mystical experience, and then I realized how many people aren't sure what they believe and are going along with emotions. And then I started to upset the apple cart because I felt a need to care for people who were left behind, who were in faith transition or doubt. And the whole time I ignored my feelings in the process. First, it was about the feelings of other people who were evangelical Christians who were in my church. And then it became about the feelings of people who were going through faith transitions. But I never acknowledged my own feelings in that dynamic, which led me to treat one group as a persecutor and another group as victims in need of rescue. And at no point did I acknowledge the agency and wholeness and humanity of either group. It's a very, and don't get me wrong, I still did some really great work, and people really appreciate me. And I did kind of help start a national conversation about faith transitions and doubts that was not being had. I think really when the Liturgist podcast hit the scene, the only person really speaking loudly about doubt and faith transition in the world of media was Rachel Held Evans. And, we came along and she was involved with our work very early on. And we really expanded that conversation to a degree that hadn't been. Nobody talked about deconstruction or ex-evangelical or any of these terms back then. So I'm not saying the work wasn't important. What I'm saying is, as I've moved further in my life and I've matured, I've realized I would have that conversation in a different way today. I wouldn't have waited 2 years to say, I'm not sure I believe these things anymore. And I wouldn't have felt like I, by sharing the truth of my life, could destroy another person's life or faith. I wouldn't have taken responsibility in the same way. I would have said, we need to have this conversation for these people, but I wouldn't have viewed myself as their like personal rescuer. I would have just tried to say, what can we talk about and do together? This is big work for people who grew up in the evangelical church, because we were literally taught that if we didn't share the gospel, people would go to hell for eternity. That's a heavy message to tell a 4-year-old. That leaves a psychological mark. And here I am, I don't know, 41, 42, 43, something like that. And I am still unlearning those early lessons of spiritual codependency.
I feel like I could ask you questions all day, so we won't do that to you. But thank you so much for just sharing. And I just want to kind of land with one last question, and it's something we've been asking all of the people that we've interviewed. Rob Bell answered it, Austin Channing Brown, you, and then we have a few more that we'll be answering for the next few weeks. But as we approach Easter, what does resurrection mean to you?
It's never too late. That's what resurrection means to me. It's never too late. I write about this a little in Finding God in the Waves, but I think that resurrection is the language of the cosmos. It's the signature of creation. Planets are resurrected stardust. Organisms are resurrected planetary matter. Everything that lives because something lived before it and lended through a miraculous process matter and energy in a way that allows us to exist moment by moment. At some point, the collection of patterns that is me will stop, but then everything that made me will continue to make Earth and life for as long as Earth and life exist. And even beyond that, we understand there's a great cosmic cycle in which nothing is ever wasted. So on Easter, I love to contemplate this notion that there was once a person so divine that death itself did not have a permanent effect on that person. Now, we can get really caught up on medical science and the forensics of an empty tomb and whether that actually happened. And I think that's a fine discussion for people to have if they are interested in having it. I've had it to the point that I'm not interested in that line of inquiry anymore. And instead, on Easter, I celebrate the idea that God is love, and that with love, there's no such thing as too late.
That's good. Well, Mike, thank you once again for spending time with us. We appreciate it. If people want to hear more, learn more, follow your work, follow not only kind of the work that you're doing via social media, your podcast and whatnot, but get more information about your imminent book release, things like that. How do people find you? How do they keep tabs on what you're doing?
The easiest thing to do is just go to my website, MikeMcHargue.com. McHargue's really hard to spell. It's MCHargue, like let's argue about the age of the earth. If that's even too much, if you go to AskScienceMike.com, you can link over to my main website pretty easily.
Awesome. Well, once again, thank you. Blair, thank you as well. This has been fun.
Thank you.
First thing you and I got to kind of do together, so
yeah,
that's cool. Well, Mike, take care. Thank you for the work that you're doing. Keep it up because it is meaningful work.
Thank you so much. It's been really good to spend time with you all today.
Thanks, Mike. Well, that was insightful and really interesting, a lot to process. But what was your favorite part, or what stood out to you?
That's tough. I'm going to actually go with his comment about resurrection. I think all three of our guests the last 3 weeks have done kind of their own spin on this idea of possibility. And that has probably been the thing that's kept me going the most during this pandemic, during this period of physical distancing that we're all going through, as I'm wrestling with the anxiety and the shame that Mike talked about when it comes to finding rhythms and routines with my kids and with my wife at home and me at home and all that. And so I love just another in our watershed community, we've talked about this idea in the past of like turning to gem, which is approaching a biblical story or any story really, and just kind of looking at it from a different angle and gleaning new insights from it, over and over again. And so just to hear kind of just another take on this notion of possibility, almost as if possibility is another name of God. And, so Mike framing it as the story is never over, it's never too late. I think it was just a really beautiful new take on this conversation that we've been having about resurrection. So that was it for me. What about you?
Yeah, I appreciated that as well. And in his resurrection comment, he talked to a little bit just about that whole idea of it's almost like a communal effect, like how things keep going even whenever we're not here and there's something bigger than us, at play. And so I just thought that was beautiful. And I think about that even too with like, what does Easter look like to our kids, and what are good things for us to communicate with them about why this is special. And it's so easy to get stuck in those places where you want to argue about things and talk about what's real, what's not, what's historical, what's not, but that is just the bigger picture, I think, is what he talked about. And so I really appreciated that.
Awesome. Well, Watershed, thank you for joining us this morning. Stay safe, stay distanced. Like Mike said, this is something that we need to take seriously, but we can feel empowered in the fact that we can take it seriously, and that in doing so, we really are making a difference in fighting back against this pandemic. And so, once again, thank you. And remember, we're continuing to roll out new ways to stay connected. And so, kind of just as a general catch-all, if you're looking for a way to stay connected during this time, just shoot an email to info@watershedcharlotte.com, and that'll make its way to whoever it needs to make its way to. We love you. We miss seeing you all in person. Can't wait to meet again together, but we are grateful for the technology that allows us to stay connected in spite of this. So take care. Happy Sunday. See ya.